everybody. My name is Ken Poirier, and today I'm talking about Fight Club by Chuck Phalahiuk. So anyway, it's a great book, and you should read it. But I'm not going to talk about what's in the book. It's a great book. There's a movie. The movie version is slightly different than the book, but not really that much. But there's definitely a difference in, I think, tone, and there's a different ending in the book versus the movie. So, which I always I really like it when books are different than the movies, or that they add information to each other. That's really what I like. You know, I enjoyed, like, say, particularly the Hunger Games movie was good. I dug it, but when I read the book. Um, it added details that made the movie more enjoyable. And that's what I think you should have between book and movie adaptations. But I'm not here to talk about the differences between the book and the movie of Fight Club. Oh, also there's a sequel that's a comic book, or graphic novel if you prefer, called Fight Club 2, which you should also read if you get the chance and you enjoy um, Chuck P's work. Let's just call him Chuck P. But I'm here to talk today about the foreword, which is called There Was a Book. In fact, I'm going to read it to you, because really that's what I liked best about this particular print. This is actually the revised, well, it's not the revised, it's a reprint edition. It's not the original release, which came out in 1995. This came out after, I think, several years after the movie came out. They do not put a edition date in this book for one reason or another. I've combed over it and can't seem to find where they are hiding that. But I'm going to read to you the foreword because it was super duper inspirational to me as a writer. Yes, this is a big fancy writing word, super duper. But I want you to hear it because I think the words that Mr. Chuck P says in this um, book are very good, and if you are interested in being a writer at all, um, you should hear it. So there was a book. He leaned forward, his breath the smell of whiskey drunk straight from the bottle, his mouth never all the way closed, his blue eyes never more than half open. His one hand held a coiled loop of rope, the old hemp kind, blonde as his hair, yellow as his cowboy hat, the cowboy kind of rope, and he shook the rope in my face as he talked. Behind him, an open door showed a flight of stairs that went down into the dark. He was young, with a flat stomach, wearing a white t-shirt and brown cowboy boots with thick heels. His hair blonde under the straw cowboy hat. A belt with a big metal buckle holding up blue jeans. His skinny white arms tanned smooth as the pointed toe of each cowboy boot. His eyes veined with a forest of little red lines. He says to grab hold of the rope and grip it tight. And pulling the rope, he starts down, his cowboy heels hammered a step, then another hardwood knock into the dark basement. There in the dark, dragging me, his breath, the whiskey smell, the same as the cotton ball in the doctor's office. The cold touch of rubbing alcohol the moment before an injection. It's a wonderful, beautiful description here. There, another step into the dark. The cowboy says, the first rule of the haunted tunnel tour is you don't talk about the haunted tunnel tour. And I stop, the rope still a loose, sagging smile between us. And the second rule of haunted tunnel tour, the cowboy his whiskey smell says, is you don't talk about the haunted tunnel tour. The rope, the feeling of braided fibers, is twisted hard and the greasy smooth in my hand, and still stopped pulling back on the rope. I tell him, hey. From the dark, the cowboy says, hey, what? I say, I wrote that book. The rope between us going tighter, tighter, tight. The rope stops the cowboy. From the dark, he says, rope what? Fight Club, I tell him. And there, the cowboy takes a step back up, the knock off of his boot on a step closer. He tilts his hat back for a better look and pushes his eyes at me, blinking fast. His breath, Boilermaker strong, breathalyzer strong, says, there was a book? That's great. That's a great line. Yes. Before there was the movie, before 4-H clubs in Virginia were busted for running fight clubs, before Donatella Versace screwed razor blades into men's clothing and called it the Fight Club look, before Gucci fashion models walked the runway shirtless with black eyes, bruised and bloodied and banged, before the houses like Dolce and Gabbana, I think he's just putting these names in here to make his name sound easier to pronounce, launched their new men's look, Sainty 1970s shirts in photo mural patterns, camouflage print pants, and tight, low-slung leather pants in Milan's dirty concrete basements, before young men started scarring kisses into their hands with lye or superglue, before young men around the world took legal action to change their names to Tyler Durden. Before the band Limp Bizkit bannered their website with Dr. Tyler Durden's recommendations, a healthy dose of Limp Bizkit. Before you could walk into Office Depot shopping for plain, matty, white labels, and there was an Avery Denton package, product item 8293, was a sample label printed, Tyler Durden, 420 Paper Street, Wilmington, DA, 19886. Before nightclub fistfighting in Brazil, where some nights young men would fight to their deaths. Before the Weekly Standard announced the crisis of manliness. Before Susan Foley's book, Stiffed, The Betrayal of American Men. Before the students of Brigham Young University fought for their right to beat one another on Monday nights, insisting there was nothing in Mormon law that prohibited their Provo Fight Club. Before the son of Utah Governor Mike Leavitt was charged with disturbing the peace and trespassing for running a fight club in a Mormon church. Before the Onion newspaper ran an expose on the Quilting Society, where old ladies would meet in church basements, lusting for bare-knuckled hand-stitching action, where the first rule of Quilting Society is that you don't talk about the quilting. Before Saturday Night Live featured Fight Like a Girl Club, before magazine and newspaper editors started calling, asking where to find a typical fight club in their area so they could send an undercover reporter to write a feature story, assuring me that they wouldn't screw up the secret nature of any club chapter. Before national political cartoons featured Congressional Fight Club. Before the University of Pennsylvania hosted conferences where academics discredited Fight Club with everything from Freud to soft sculpture to interpretive dance. Before a zillion fuck club porn sites. Before a zillion restaurant interviews headlined Bite Club. Before Rumbling Boys Inc. started labeling their men's grooming products hair mousse and gel with Tyler Durden quotes. Before you could walk through airports and hear the bogus public address announcements paging Tyler Durden, would Tyler Durden please pick up the white courtesy phone? Before you could find graffiti in Los Angeles spray painting tags that claimed Tyler Durden lives. Before people in Texas started wearing t-shirts printed with Save Marla Singer. Before a variety of illegal fight clubs stage plays. Before my refrigerator was covered with photographs sent to me by strangers, grinning, bruised faces, and people grappling in backyard boxing rings. Before the book in a dozen languages, Club de Combate and Devechta Club and Borlaki Club and Club Goth Petish and Kovas Klobus, and before that, ... I got to take a breath because that's just the intro to this wonderful foreword by Mr. Chuck P. I'm going to have a sip of my coffee. I'm going through this. I want you to hear this because I think it's important. Before all that, there was just a short story. It was just an experiment to kill a slow afternoon at work. Instead of walking a character from scene to scene in a story, there had to be some way to just cut, to jump from scene to scene without losing the reader, to show every aspect of a story, but only the kernel of each aspect. The core moment, then another core moment, then another. There had to be some kind of chorus, something bland that wouldn't hold the reader's attention, but would act to signal a jump from a new angle or aspect of the story. A bland kind of buffer that would be the touchstone or landmark a reader would need to not feel lost. A kind of neutral sorbet, like something served between courses in a fancy dinner. A signal, like buffer music in radio broadcasts to announce the next topic, the next jump. A kind of glue or mortar that would hold together a mosaic of different moments and details, giving them all the continuity and yet shadow casting each moment, not ramming it up against the next moment. Think of the movie Citizen Kane and how the faceless, nameless newsreel reporters create a framework for telling the story from lots of different sources. That's what I wanted to do. That one boring afternoon at work. For that chorus, the traditional device, I wrote 8 rules. The whole idea of Fight Club wasn't important. It was arbitrary. But the 8 rules had to apply to something, so why not a club where you could ask someone to fight? There was a way you'd ask for a dance at a disco, or challenge someone to a game of pool or darts. The fighting wasn't the important part of the story. What I needed was the rules, those bland landmarks that would allow me to describe this club from the past, the present, or up close or far away, the beginning and evolution, to cram together a lot of details and moments, all within 7 pages, and not lose the reader. At the time, I had a lingering black eye, a souvenir from a fistfight during my summer vacation. Nobody I worked with had ever asked about it. I figured that you could do anything in your private life if it left you so bruised that no one would want to know the details. At the same time, I had seen Bill Moyer television program about how street gangs were really young men raised without fathers, just trying to help one another become men. They issued orders and challenges, imposed rules and discipline, rewarded action, all the things a coach or drill sergeant would do. At the same time, the bookstores were full of books like The Joy Luck Club and The Divine Secrets of the Yaya Sisterhood and How to Make an American Quilt. These were all novels that presented social models for women to be together, to sit together and tell their stories, to share their lives, but there was no novel that presented a new social model for men to share their lives. It would have to give men the structure and rules of a game or a task, but not too touchy-feely. It would have to model the new way to gather and be together. It could have been barn raising club or golf club. It would have probably sold a lot more books, something non-threatening. But that one slow afternoon, I wrote a 7-page story called Fight Club. It was the first real story I ever sold, an anthology called The Pursuit of Happiness, published by Blue Heron Press. Bought it for $50. In the first edition, the publishers Dennis and Lenny Stovall printed every copy with the wrong title on the spine. The cost of reprinting bankrupted their small press. Today, they've sold every copy. Those printed and misprinted. Most people are looking for that original story that has since become Chapter 6 of the book, Fight Club. It was only 7 pages because my writing teacher, Tom Spanbauer, who I recommend you look up, Tom Stanborough, look, it's on the goddamn crease. I know you can't see it. Come on, focus. I wish there was a way to make this camera focus. Tom Spanbauer. Break it up there. All right. So Tom Spanbauer, he teaches this class called Dangerous Writing, and I recommend you check it out. Had joked that the 7 pages were the perfect length for a short story. To make the short story into a book, I added every story my friends could tell. Every party I attended gave me more material. There's a short story about Mike splicing porno into family movies. There's a story about Jeff pissing in soup as a banquet waiter. Once a friend worried that these stories might prompt people to copycat, and I insisted that they were just blue-collar nobodies living in Oregon with public school educations. There was nothing we could imagine that a million people weren't already doing. Years later in London, a young man pulled me aside before a book event. He was a waiter at a 5-star restaurant, one of the only 2 5-star restaurants in the city, and he loved how I depicted waiters spoiling food. Long before they read my book, he and the other servers had messed with the food they served celebrities. When I asked him to name one celebrity, he shook his head. No, he couldn't risk telling. When I refused to sign the book, he waved me closer and whispered, "Margaret Thatcher has eaten my cum." He held up one hand, his fingers spread, and said, "At least 5 times." In the workshop where I started to write fiction, you had to read your work in public. Most of the times you read it in a bar or coffee house where you had been competing with the roar of the espresso machine or the football game on the television. Music and drunk people talking against all the noise and distraction. Only the most shocking, most physical, dark, and funny stories got to be heard. Our test audience would never sit still for Barn Raising Club. Really, what I had been writing was just The Great Gatsby, updated a little. It was... God damn these fucking words. So I have a bit of dyslexia. It's a big challenge as both a reader and a writer. It was apostolic fiction, where a surviving apostle tells the story of his hero. There are 2 men and a woman, and one man, the hero, is shot to death. It was a classic, ancient romance, but updated to compete with the espresso machine and ESPN. It took me 3 months to write that first draft, and the book sold to W. W. Norton in 3 days. For an advance so small, I never told anyone, not anybody. It was $6,000. Other authors now tell me this is called kiss-off money. It is an advance so low the author is supposed to feel insulted and walk away. This lets the publisher off the hook without offending any staff members who wanted to acquire the book. Man, I wish somebody would give me an advance of $6,000. That would make my life a lot better. Still, it was $6,000. That would pay my rent for a year. Oh, to be in the glorious 90s again. So I took it, and in August 1996, there was a hardcover book and a 3-city tour, Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco, where no more than 3 people showed up at any reading. The book sales didn't even cover what I drank out of the hotel minibars. One reviewer called the book science fiction, another called it a satire on the Iron John men's movement. Another called it a satire of corporate white-collar culture. Some called it horror. No one called it a romance. I wouldn't call this a romance. I mean, it's a good book. It's literary? I don't know. It's offbeat, I guess. Noir. It's a good noir. It's not a romance, though. In Berkeley, a radio interview asked me, having written this book, what can you tell us about the status of the American woman in the world today? In Los Angeles, a college professor on National Public Radio said the book was a failure because it didn't address the issue of racism. On a plane back to Portland, an airline flight attendant leaned closer and asked me to tell him the truth. His theory was the book wasn't really about fighting at all. He insisted it was really about gay men watching one another fuck in public steam baths. I told him, yeah, what the hell? And he gave me free drinks for the rest of the flight. The other reviewers hated it. Oh, they called it too dark, too violent, too strident and shrill and dogmatic. They would have loved Barn Raising Club. Still, it won the 1997 Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award. In 1997, Oregon Book Award for the Best Novel. A year later, the KGB Literary Bar in Lower Manhattan, a woman introduced herself to me. She was the lead judge for the Oregon Award and said that she had to fight tooth and nail to convince the other judges. God bless her. A year later, in the same bar, another woman introduced herself to me, saying how she'd been designing a computer-animated penguin for the Fight Club movie. Then there was Brad Pitt, Edward Norton, and Helena Bonham Carter. Since then, thousands of people have written, most of them saying thank you for writing something that got their son to start reading again, or their husband, or their students, or other people wrote letters a little angry saying how they'd invented the whole idea of fight clubs in military boot camps or other Depression-era labor camps. They had gotten drunk and asked one another, hit me as hard as you can. I know some of these people. There have always been fight clubs, they say. There always be fight clubs. Waiters will always pee in the soup. People will always fall in love. Now, 7 books later, men still ask me to find the fight club in their area. Women still ask me if there's a fight club where they can fight one another. Now, this is the first rule of Fight Club. There is nothing a blue-collared nobody in Oregon with a public school education can imagine that a million billion other people haven't already done. In the mountains of Bolivia, one place the book has yet to be published, thousands of miles from the drunk cowboy and his haunted tunnel tour, every year the poorest people gather in the high Andes villages to celebrate the festival of Tinku. There, the campesino men beat the crap out of one another, drunk and bloody, and they pound one another with just their bare fist chanting, "We are men, we are men, we are men." The men fight the men. Sometimes the women fight one another. They fight the way they have for centuries. In their world, with little income or wealth, few possessions, and no education or opportunity, it is the festival they look forward to all year long. Then, when they're exhausted, the men and women go to church and they get married. Being tired isn't the same as being rich, but most times it's close enough. And that is the introduction to Fight Club. And I read it to you because I want you to think about this, to think about this idea. If you're a writer or you're evaluating a writer, somebody else's written work, if you're a critic or whatever, think about that idea that, number one, you're not going to come up with anything new. You're not going to come up with anything original. What you are going to do is you're going to, at best, come up with an original way to convey an unoriginal idea. Also, you may set out to write a romance, and that doesn't happen. And third, or whatever, you might set out to write an action and end up writing a romance, or you might end up trying to write a paranormal thriller, as I was with Fake Tattoos, which was the book inspired by that foreword by Mr. Chuck Phalahiuk. I think that's how you say it. Don't quote me on his pronunciation of his last name. I don't know if anybody knows the exact right way to pronounce it. But anyway, this foreword here inspired Fake Tattoos. And originally that was going to be a paranormal thriller. All right. And that paranormal thriller turned into a horror. It started off as a paranormal thriller, started becoming a romance, and in the end it was a horror. But however you want to interpret it, that's up to you. These are just merely labels. And the third thing that I want you to take away from this is write honestly. Be honest. That was the one thing that I really, really got out of this is the importance of honesty, because I had been writing stuff for years and years and years, and I was so focused on this idea of crafting, of writing that perfect novel, writing to the market, trying to write something that would make money, all right, and in doing that, everything I was writing was failing because it wasn't being honest. And when you're not being honest, it comes across as fake, and either consciously or subconsciously, those readers can see that, and agents can see that, publishers can see that, even if the writer can't. And a lot of people, it takes them several books to get to that place. Me, I would, when I read this, when I picked this up and read this, I was in dire straits. All right. I was on the brink of being homeless, ended up being homeless, was homeless for like 6 months, until I got into this place last week. And this is why I've been able to set up my computer and do this video and all of this. And it forced me to write honestly, because I was writing like I could be dead at any moment. And that's how I felt for months and months and months. I felt like I could be dead at any moment. And if I'm going to bother to spend time writing something, it should be something truthful and honest. And that's what, you know, that's what this forward is about, really. It doesn't matter if it's your story or somebody else's story. Write something that's true. Write the truth. Because that's really what everybody wants. We all like nice, fantastical stories that allow us to escape. But we can't escape if we don't believe in that reality that the writer is creating. And Tom Spanbauer, who's based out of Oregon, who I don't know if he's writing books anymore. I think he's more of a teacher. I don't really know all that much about him, but he's got a website. Look it up. And what Mr. Chuck P describes in this forward, without blatantly saying it, is he's talking about the dangerous writing style that Tom Spanbauer writing philosophy. And I didn't even find out about this until after I was done with the book and I was looking at agents and I was trying to get it published. And I was looking at Mr. Chuck P as the model and going through basically his entire contact list and researching everybody that he knows like a crazy stalker, which is what you have to do when you're trying to get a book published. And so that's really the story of this forward. It's talking about dangerous writing and how you have to not be afraid to write the truth, even if it's fiction. Even if it's not facts, even if you're not writing facts, you have to write the truth, because that's what people want to read. Because if it's the truth, they'll believe it, and if they believe it, they'll be able to escape into another world, and they'll be able to think about the problems in this other world. They can think about the problems of the other world without having to deal with the stress of their own world, and then they'll come back from this world with a thought, a concept, a philosophy, an idea, a question that will make them re-examine the world that they live in. And that's what this is really, really about. A lot of people think that this is just kind of Mr. Chuck P's complaints about success or lack thereof or whatever, and it's not. It's about being honest even when it makes you look like kind of a dick. There was a book by Mr. Chuck Phalahiuk. Anyway, thank you for listening to this forward. I hope it inspires you, and if you know a writer, share it with them so that they can be inspired. If you have an older copy of the book, this forward is not in it. So if you want to pick up a newer copy of the book to give to somebody so that they can read this for themselves, I highly recommend it. This is like not my favorite book by this author. That's Choke, but definitely my favorite forward in a book ever. So thank you. Where is my mind?